Hello everyone, welcome to Fullmoon Movies. There are some movies where the story stays with you, and there are others where the entire experience, such as the images, sounds, performances, and atmosphere, stays in your mind long after the movie ends. Robert Eggers' The Lighthouse belongs firmly into the second category. Released in 2019 and starring Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson, this is essentially a film about two men, one lighthouse, and the gradual destruction of their relationship and sanity. Yet, from that incredibly simple setup, Eggers creates something that really feels like a psychological horror, dark comedy, mythology, and an old maritime nightmare all rolled into one. Now, perhaps the first thing that immediately separates The Lighthouse from almost every modern movie is its appearance. Eggers and cinematographer Jarin Balshki made the bold decision to shoot the film on a 35mm black and white film using a Kodak XXX stock, rather than a simply shooting digitally and removing the color afterwards. They also use special filtration and vintage style lenses to approximate the harsh tonal characteristics of early photographic processes. The result is an image filled with grain, deep blacks, bright highlights, and extraordinary textures, particularly on the faces of Dafoe and Pattinson. Now, the black and white photography isn't simply there to make the movie look artistic or old fashioned. It removes the comfort of color from the environment. The sea becomes almost metallic, the sky becomes threatening, and the faces of these two men become landscapes of a sweet dirt, wrinkles, and exhaustion. There are moments where Willem Dafoe's face almost looks like something carved out of stone. Eggers makes us feel as though we have discovered a forgotten maritime photograph from the 19th century and somehow entered it. Then there is this unusual 1.19 is to 1 aspect ratio. Now, instead of a widescreen image we associate with modern cinema, the Lighthouse gives us almost a square frame. Eggers originally considered 1.33 is to 1, but Blacksky suggested the narrower 1.19 is to 1 format, which had briefly existed during the transition to sound cinema. It has particularly have an effective for framing the vertical lighthouse. There are moments where Willem Dafoe's face almost looks like something carved out of stone. Eggers makes us feel as though we have discovered a forgotten maritime photograph from the 19th century and somehow entered it. Then there is this unusual 1.19 is to 1 aspect ratio. Now, instead of a widescreen image we associate with modern cinema, the Lighthouse gives us almost a square frame. Eggers originally considered 1.33 is to 1, but Blacksky suggested the narrower 1.19 is to 1 format, which had briefly existed during the transition to sound cinema. It was particularly effective for framing the vertical lighthouse, the cramped interiors, and the two characters trapped together. Now, this is where the aspect ratio really becomes part of the storytelling. Normally, when we think about the ocean, we imagine an enormous widescreen landscape stretching towards the horizon. Now, Eggers does almost the opposite. He takes this huge open environment and squeezes it into a narrow box. Even when the characters are outside, there is a feeling that they cannot really escape it. When Thomas Wick and Ephraim Winslow are together inside the lighthouse quarters, the frame seems almost too small to contain them. They are physically and psychologically trapped together. Now, this is also why the film works despite being essentially only two central characters. Willem Dafoe plays Thomas Wick, the experienced lighthouse keeper who seems to belong to another century entirely. His language, mannerisms, superstitions, and almost biblical speeches make him feel like someone who has emerged directly from an old maritime legend. Robert Pattinson plays Ephraim Winslow, the younger man arriving for what should have been a temporary assignment. Initially, their relationship is relatively straightforward. Wake is the authority figure and Winslow is the subordinate. Wake controls the lighthouse itself while forcing Winslow to perform the exhausting physical labor, such as carrying the coal, cleaning, repairing equipment, and maintaining the grounds. Now, but slowly that relationship actually changes. Resentment develops, alcohol enters the equation. Stories begin contradicting one another. Time itself becomes uncertain, and eventually we begin questioning whether what we are really seeing is actually really happening. This is where Pattinson gives one of the most interesting performances of his career. At the beginning, he appears controlled and quiet, almost deliberately suppressing his emotions. But as the film progresses, that restraint gradually disappears. His frustration becomes anger, his anger becomes paranoia, and his perception of reality begins collapsing. Dafoe, meanwhile, is magnificent. He can be frightening in one moment, ridiculous in another, and strangely sympathetic shortly afterwards. His enormous monologues sounds almost Shakespearean, particularly when the wake begins invoking the sea and its supernatural powers. The chemistry between Dafoe and Pattinson is in the engine of the entire movie. Contemporary accounts of the production also emphasized how central that tension between the two performances was to Eggers' approach. But what exactly is the Lighthouse about? This is where the movie becomes fascinating because Eggers never provides one simple answer. On one level, it is also about isolation. For example, put two incompatible people into a confined environment for long enough, and their smallest disagreements can become enormous. In another level, it's all about power. Wake controls access to the light at the top of the lighthouse. On the other hand, Winslow desperately wants to know what is there. The light, therefore, becomes something more than a piece of machinery. It becomes a forbidden knowledge, authority, desire, and perhaps even something divine. The film also draws heavily upon mythology. There are chaos of Prometheus, the figure from Greek mythology, who actually steals the fire from the gods and suffer terrible punishment. Winslow's desire to reach the light, where it can be interpreted in something very similar, a man reaching towards something forbidden and ultimately for his ambition. Now, there is the sea itself. Mermaids, seabirds, storms, strange visions continually blur the boundary between maritime superstition and psychological breakdown. Eggers never clearly tells us whether supernatural forces are genuinely present or whether these two men are simply losing their minds. And I think that ambiguity is one of the movie's greatest strengths. You can watch The Lighthouse several times and come away with different interpretations. Perhaps everything is really supernatural, is really real, or perhaps almost none of it is. Perhaps alcohol, isolation, and guilt are producing hallucinations. Or perhaps the island has become some kind of mythological space where ordinary rules no longer apply. The movie really refuses to solve itself for you. And to me, I really love movies about Lighthouse. Another reason the film remains so engaging is its extraordinary sound design. The constant foghorn becomes almost another character. Its deep mechanical sound repeatedly interrupts the silence, creating an oppressive rhythm throughout the film. Add the crashing waves, wind machinery, and Mark Corvan's unsettling score, and the entire environment begins to feel hostile. Interestingly, The Lighthouse was never a conventional blockbuster, nor was it designed to be one. Made for a reported budget of approximately 11 million, it earned roughly 18 million worldwide, including around 10.9 million in United States and Canada. Now, those numbers might appear modest compared to the mainstream Hollywood productions, but The Lighthouse was an unusual black and white, nearly squared form art house film built around two characters arguing, drinking, and gradually descending into madness. Its significance, therefore, isn't really measured by blockbuster box office numbers. Its much greater achievement has been its cultural longevity. And this brings us to why The Lighthouse still feels relevant today. In some ways, I think the film has become even easier to understand. We now live in a world where isolation, loneliness, difficult workplace relationships, and psychological pressure are widely discussed. Now, that idea of being trapped in a confined environment with someone you cannot escape suddenly doesn't feel like an abstract 19th century problem. The relationship between Wake and Winslow can even be viewed as an extreme workplace relationship. One person controls hierarchy, the other performs the undesirable work, and communications break down, resentment develops, and eventually neither person completely trusts each other. But there is something deeper as well. We live in an era where films are becoming increasingly clean, digitally polished, and visually similar. And here, the Lighthouse deliberately moves into the opposite direction. The image is grainy, the frame is narrow, faces aren't beautified, and darkness is allowed to remain dark. The movie embraces this imperfection. Now, that makes it feel strangely timeless. You could really watch a single frame without knowing when the movie was produced and imagine that it came from decades earlier. Bluray weren't simply trying to imitate an old movie, they used historical filmmaking language to place us psychologically inside another world. Bluray specifically explained that the 1.19:1 frame helped to isolate the characters and withhold visual information, while the black and white photography provided a physical texture that digital imagery would not really reproduce in quite the same way. And this is ultimately what makes The Lighthouse such a fascinating film. It doesn't really give us a comfortable story, it gives us an experience. The black and white cinematography isn't just a gimmick. The 1.19:1 aspect ratio isn't simply there to make the movie look unusual. The strange dialogue and oppressive sound design, mythology, and increasingly unreliable characters all work together to trap us inside the same world as these two lighthouse keepers. Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson delivers two extraordinary performances because there is nowhere for either actor to hide. The camera is frequently close to their faces, the narrow frame keeps our attention locked onto them, and their performances have to carry almost the entire movie. The Lighthouse may have earned only around 18 million worldwide, but its legacy has become considerably larger than its theatrical numbers suggest. It remains one of the most visually distinctive films of the last decade and one of the strongest examples of how cinematography, aspect ratio, sound, and performance can become part of storytelling rather than simply presentation. More than anything, The Lighthouse reminds us that cinema doesn't always need to explain everything. Sometimes the unanswered questions are precisely what keeps a movie alive. And years after watching it, you may still find yourself wondering what exactly was inside that light. And perhaps the fact that we never completely know is the reason we continue thinking about it. Now, this movie is a must watch.